The autumn rain fell upon the manor with a persistence that matched the gravity of the moment. Through the tall windows of the corridor, the world beyond appeared grey and indistinct, as though even the weather conspired to witness what should remain hidden. Lysandra Vale stood motionless before the grand staircase, her modest travelling cloak drawn tightly about her shoulders, her gloved hands trembling as they clutched a small leather valise. The household staff had withdrawn into the shadows, a mercy born of their uncertainty regarding the truth of what had transpired. Whispers travelled through the servants' quarters, with the inevitability of plague, each iteration of the rumour more grotesque than the last. The laundry-maid had sworn she'd overheard something scandalous. The under-butler had nodded knowingly. And so the story had grown, cultivated in hushed tones and careful silences, until it had become something neither she nor anyone of conscience could have conceived. Lady Verena Coldmere had been thorough in her work. Miss Vale. The voice came from above, measured and grave. She did not need to lift her eyes to recognize it. The Reverend Silas Hartwell descended the staircase with the solemnity of a man bearing the weight of moral judgment. His spectacles caught the gaslight, rendering his eyes opaque and impenetrable. "I trust the letter of reference has been provided to you, however limited the circumstances necessitate." Lysandra raised her gaze, and in that moment the Reverend saw something that gave him pause. Not defiance, but a composed dignity that no number of accusations could fracture. Her hazel-green eyes were dry, though the landscape of her heart had been ravaged entirely. "I am grateful for any courtesy extended, Reverend," she replied, her voice steady and measured. "Though I confess I do not fully comprehend the necessity of my departure, I have committed no crime, save to exist in a place where certain persons deemed my presence inconvenient." The Reverend adjusted his collar, a gesture born of discomfort rather than necessity. "My dear Miss Vale, propriety exists for the preservation of all. When whispers reach the ears of the household, when a young lady of your station finds herself alone with His Grace, in circumstances that might be misinterpreted, it becomes impossible to ignore the demands of society. You understand, I am certain, that discretion and distance are sometimes the only honourable course." "I understand," Lysandra said, "that truth and honour are often sacrificed upon the altar of convenient falsehood." The words hung between them, neither accusatory nor submissive, simply true. The Reverend had no answer to offer that would not further expose his own complicity in the machinery that had condemned her. At that moment, a door opened from the direction of the Duke's study. His Grace Alistair Winthorne stood framed in the doorway. His expression was a study in controlled restraint, the careful arrangement of features that aristocratic men have perfected across generations. Yet something flickered behind his grey eyes, a conflict unresolved, a truth withheld. "Miss Vale," he said, and the formality of his address struck her like a physical blow. Where once there had been warmth, now there was only the polite distance of protocol. "Your carriage awaits. I trust you will find the arrangements adequate for your journey." He could not look at her, not truly, and that absence of his gaze, that refusal to meet her eyes, spoke more eloquently than any protestation of innocence ever could. In that moment, Lysandra understood with crystalline clarity that he had chosen belief in the lie over faith in her character. Whether through weakness or through fear of social censure, he had allowed her to be sacrificed. The tears came then, not from despair but from the peculiar agony of discovering that one's heart has been invested in a vessel unequal to its contents. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was barely audible above the percussion of rain against the window panes, "I shall trouble your household no further. Pray tell the staff that I have taken my leave with gratitude for their kind treatment. And should anyone inquire as to my character, I trust you will allow the truth of my conduct to speak for itself, however tardy that truth may be in arriving." She did not wait for his response. To have done so would have been to surrender entirely to the dissolution threatening to overtake her. Instead, she turned toward the door, her posture upright, her movements precise. The Reverend stepped aside, as though her departure held a contagion that proximity might transmit. As she crossed the threshold into the November afternoon, the weight of years descended upon her shoulders like an accumulation of snow. The carriage stood ready, ancient and austere. The coachman, an old man whose loyalty to the household was absolute, helped her ascend without meeting her gaze. As the vehicle lurched forward, Lysandra turned back once to glimpse the manor through the rain-streaked window. The architecture of that great house seemed to recede not merely in distance, but in significance, as though her expulsion from it had also rendered it somehow less real. Yet one window, the third-floor gallery, where she and the Duke had stood beneath a portrait of his mother, seemed to hold her attention with an almost supernatural insistence. She did not know then that 12 years would pass before she would see that window again. She did not know that a letter, written in the deepest watches of night and sealed with the bitter wax of necessity, would eventually make its way back to the man she had loved, with an intensity that the brevity of seasons could not explain. She knew only that her heart, already fractured, had entered a silence from which no voice, not even her own, seemed capable of recalling it. The rain continued to fall. The carriage disappeared into the grey English afternoon. And within the manor, the Duke stood at the window of his study, watching her departure with an expression that might have resembled remorse, had remorse possessed the power to alter what was already lost. 12 years render a landscape unrecognizable. They soften the sharp edges of memory, blur the certainties of youth, and transform even the most indelible truths into something resembling legend. Lysandra Vale had become, in the small village of Ashworth, where she had established her modest residence, a woman of quiet reputation and quieter sorrows. She had taken employment as a companion to the elderly widow, Mrs. Whitmore, a woman of considerable fortune but limited family affection. The arrangement had suited them both. Mrs. Whitmore required someone of education and discretion, and Lysandra required a sanctuary where questions were not asked and pasts were permitted to remain undisturbed. The cottage where they resided overlooked the valley, a prospect both beautiful and melancholic. From the parlour window, Lysandra would often gaze toward the distant rise of hills, contemplating how geography itself seemed to conspire in the separation of souls. Distance, she had come to understand, was not merely physical. It was temporal, moral, and emotional in equal measure. Years, however, had not diminished her internal landscape. If anything, they had enriched it with a complexity born of solitude and reflection. Lysandra had transformed her pain into something approximating wisdom. She read voraciously, philosophy, poetry, theology, seeking within those pages some explanation for why certain moments in life wielded such power to alter all that followed. Mrs. Whitmore, despite her limited expressions of affection, had come to rely upon Lysandra with the dependence that only age can justify. When, in the spring of her 78th year, the widow had suffered a severe apoplexy, it was Lysandra who had sat vigil through the long nights, bathing her employer's fevered brow and whispering comfort in tones only half believed by the woman who uttered them. "You should marry," Mrs. Whitmore had said one afternoon, her speech still somewhat impeded by the effects of her stroke. "A woman of your accomplishments and gentleness should not be condemned to servitude." Lysandra had merely smiled, that particular expression of resignation that she had perfected across years of practice. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore, I am precisely where I ought to be. The matter requires no further contemplation." Yet it was not true. In the privacy of her small chamber beneath the rafters of the cottage, Lysandra had written. She had written extensively, pouring into foolscap the tumult of her heart. The events of those distant days when she had served in the Duke's household, the growing attachment that had flowered between herself and his Grace, and the brutal manner in which that attachment had been severed by forces she could neither combat nor fully comprehend. The letter had begun as an act of catharsis and had evolved into something approaching confession. She wrote of the afternoon in the library, when the Duke had found her weeping over a volume of Keats. She wrote of his unexpected tenderness, the way he had offered his handkerchief, and asked, with genuine concern evident in every syllable, what sorrow could possibly bring such evident distress to a woman of her evident sensibility. She wrote of the conversation that had followed, of how they had spoken for hours of poetry and philosophy, of art, and the particular loneliness that attaches itself to those of elevated station. She wrote of the moment when his hand had briefly touched hers across the desk, a contact so fleeting that she had wondered if her own heart had conjured it as some delusion born of desire. And she wrote of the terrible knowledge that had come thereafter, that their encounter had been witnessed, interpreted through the lens of malice, and transmitted into scandal by those whose power derived from the careful maintenance of social hierarchy. The letter grew in length and complexity, becoming not merely a recounting of events, but a careful construction of truth. Within its pages she sought to explain her departure not as an admission of shame, but as a choice born of honor. She had left, she wrote, because to remain would have been to expose the Duke to ridicule and suspicion. She had sacrificed her own position and reputation in silent acknowledgement of a love that could never be publicly acknowledged and therefore must be privately destroyed. As she wrote, Lysandra had no expectation that the letter would ever reach him. It was an exercise in exorcism, the deliberate articulation of what her lips could never have uttered. Yet as Mrs. Whitmore's health deteriorated, as it became increasingly evident that her employer's time in this world was approaching its terminus, Lysandra found herself seized by an impulse that transcended reason. When Mrs. Whitmore passed on a grey February morning, leaving Lysandra in modest financial security and complete solitude, the letter was completed. Sealed with wax and bearing the Duke's name in her own careful hand, it sat upon the escritoire in her chamber like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. For 3 months she could not bring herself to post it. The act of sending seemed to her a final severing, a definitive acknowledgement that what had existed between them was not merely lost, but dead. Yet to retain it was to carry a secret so profound that it began to calcify within her chest like stone. In May, under a sky of approaching summer, Lysandra had finally placed the letter in the hands of a courier, with instructions to ensure its safe delivery to the Duke's London residence. She had included no return address. She had signed it only with her Christian name. Thus, she had whispered to the empty cottage as the courier rode away, I commit my heart to the post, trusting that time, at least, will deliver what I cannot. What she did not know, what years of separation had rendered impossible for her to comprehend, was that the Duke had never truly believed in her guilt. What she could not have imagined was that his own silence had been born not of conviction but of cowardice, and that the weight of that cowardice had evolved across the years into a burden so substantial that it had begun to consume his capacity for anything approaching genuine joy. The letter would arrive, but before it did, events would unfold that would place both of them upon a threshold neither could have anticipated. The morning of the letter's arrival was unremarkable in all external respects. The sun rose over London with the indifference that celestial bodies have perfected across eons. The servants of Winthorne House proceeded through their appointed duties with mechanical precision, and the Duke, as he had done on countless mornings across the preceding 12 years, reviewed his correspondence with the detached efficiency of a man whose life had become largely administrative. He was no longer young, though neither was he aged. The years had impressed upon his features a gravity that some might have mistaken for wisdom, but which was in truth primarily the residue of sustained regret. His hair had begun to silver at the temples. Lines had accumulated around his eyes, not the pleasant creases of laughter, but the harder inscriptions of a man who had learned to contain his feelings with such deliberation that the act had begun to deform his countenance. The estate was prosperous. Parliament occasionally sought his counsel on matters relating to his considerable holdings. The title, which he had inherited at the age of 19 following his father's sudden death, had become synonymous with a kind of austere respectability. He had never married. Numerous ladies of appropriate station had been presented to him across the years, each theoretically suitable, each entirely lacking in the ineffable quality that might have inspired genuine attachment. The Morning Post had arrived as it invariably did, conveyed by his secretary with the reverence typically reserved for religious relics. Among the usual assemblage of bills, parliamentary notices, and correspondence from the various agents who managed his properties, there was a single letter whose appearance caused his habitual composure to fracture, if only momentarily. The handwriting was unmistakable. 12 years had not altered its essential character, the particular elegance of the penmanship, the way certain letters were formed with a deliberation that bespoke intelligence and care. His hand trembled as he lifted the letter. For a moment, he could not bring himself to open it. The seal bore only wax, unmarked by any crest. This alone told him something profound. The letter came from someone who wished to maintain a certain anonymity, yet whose identity was rendered transparent by the very familiarity of the script. His heart, which he had believed largely incapable of profound feeling, began a cadence that approximated panic. He dismissed his secretary with a gesture more abrupt than courtesy warranted. When he was alone, with the door of his study secured against intrusion, he carefully broke the seal. The letter comprised several pages written in the same meticulous hand. Your Grace, it began, and the formality of the address, maintained even after 12 years of silence, struck him as a kind of exquisite torment. As he read, the geography of the past reconstructed itself around him. She had written of that afternoon in the library, the conversation that had ranged across philosophy and art. She had written with such precision of his words that he recognized in her recounting a fidelity to truth that was almost painful in its exactitude. She had written of the touch of their hands, the momentary contact that had felt, even in its brevity, to contain an entire universe of unspoken meaning. And then she had written of her departure, not as a woman banished in shame, but as one who had chosen to withdraw in order to protect him from the consequences of their association. She had done so, she explained, because she had come to understand that their circumstances rendered a continuation of that attachment impossible. A lady of her station, however educated and well-intentioned, could never be a suitable match for a duke. To persist in his attentions would have been to invite ridicule and suspicion upon his name. "I departed," she had written, "not because I had erred, but because I loved you sufficiently to understand that the greatest gift I could offer was the sacrifice of my own hopes. You deserve a union that will enhance your standing, not compromise it. I do not write this letter expecting that it will alter the trajectory your life has taken these many years. Rather, I write it as a final act of truth-telling. The scandal that drove me from your household was founded upon falsehood. My conduct was proper. My affections, though never expressed aloud, were genuine and uncorrupted." The Duke found that he was standing, though he had no recollection of rising from his chair. The letter trembled in his hands as though possessed of its own volition. 12 years of careful rationalizations, of convincing himself that he had acted appropriately in accepting her departure without protest, began to crumble like ancient mortar exposed to weather. He reached for the pocket watch that he kept upon his desk, an object of only moderate value, but considerable sentimental weight. It had belonged to his father, and within its case he had inscribed the date and hour of Lysandra's departure. For 12 years the watch had remained stopped at that precise moment, a deliberate act of symbolic stasis that he had neither analyzed nor sought to remedy. As he held it now, the letter still clutched in his other hand, something seemed to shift within the mechanism of his understanding. This letter, arriving as it had across the distance of years, represented not merely a recounting of the past. It was quite possibly a final act of grace. She had chosen, despite everything, to give him the gift of absolution. But absolution, he understood with the clarity that only genuine remorse can provide, was not sufficient. He had remained silent when he should have spoken. He had accepted her banishment when he should have defended her. He had allowed fear of social censure to override the dictates of honor. The question that now presented itself was whether 12 years of separation had rendered such things irredeemable, or whether a man of genuine resolve might yet find means to repair what pride and cowardice had fractured. He read the letter a second time, then a third. By the time evening had descended upon the city, he had committed significant portions of it to memory. More importantly, he had arrived at a resolution that seemed to contain within it both the terror of potential failure and the exaltation of possible redemption. The next morning, the Duke sent word that he would be departing for the village of Ashworth. He gave his staff no further explanation. The journey itself would require 3 days of travel, and he had no certainty that the woman whose letter he now kept secured within his desk would receive him. Yet the prospect of finally confronting the fundamental error he had committed, and seeking, against all probability of success, to repair it, seemed to him a purpose sufficiently noble as to justify whatever humiliation might result from the attempt. As his carriage pulled away from Winthorne House, the Duke found himself clutching the letter, as though it were a talisman. In its pages, she had offered him not merely the truth of the past, but an opportunity, perhaps the final opportunity, to discover whether a man transformed by years of regret might yet deserve the forgiveness of the woman he had failed so fundamentally to defend. The roads from London to Ashworth were neither grand nor particularly distinguished, yet they possessed a certain austere beauty that the Duke found himself contemplating with an intensity born of nervous anticipation. The carriage moved at a measured pace, the rhythm of its motion almost meditative, yet within that methodical progression lay a tension that no amount of deliberate breathing could entirely dissipate. 3 days of travel provided ample opportunity for reflection, perhaps too much opportunity. The Duke found himself revisiting with excruciating precision each moment of those distant years when Lysandra had occupied the manor. He recalled the particular grace with which she had moved through the corridors, her habit of pausing to observe the paintings as though they possessed stories known only to her. He remembered the timbre of her voice when she had read aloud from poetry, the way her eyes had illuminated when encountering a passage that resonated with her own sensibilities. Most painfully, he recalled the conversation in the library, the one detailed so faithfully in her letter. He had been escaping, if truth were told, from a tiresome dinner party where various matrimonial prospects had been paraded before him like merchandise in an exhibition. He had sought refuge among the books, and there he had found her, her face streaked with tears, a volume of Keats open upon her lap. His inquiry as to her distress had been genuine, untainted by ulterior motive. When she had explained that she was moved by the particular poignancy of Keats's meditations upon mortality and love, he had found himself drawn into a conversation of such intellectual and emotional depth that he had temporarily forgotten the constraints of their respective stations. For those hours, they had existed in a realm where such distinctions seemed not merely irrelevant but almost absurd, and then had come the whispers. He had first heard them in the smoking room, casual insinuations delivered with the particular venomousness that English gentlemen could achieve whilst maintaining perfect civility. A young lady of unknown parentage, left alone with the Duke in his library, what could one possibly conclude? The Reverend Hartwell, it was said, had himself observed something untoward in their manner toward one another. The Duke, in those days possessed of a pride that he now recognized as both cowardly and contemptible, had chosen silence. He had not defended her. He had not proclaimed the innocence of their discourse or the propriety of their conduct. Instead, he had allowed her to withdraw, had accepted her departure as a prudent resolution to an awkward situation, and had spent the succeeding 12 years gradually understanding the magnitude of his failure. By the time the carriage pulled into Ashworth, dusk was descending in that particular manner of English spring evenings, with a softness that seemed to promise more than it could possibly deliver. The village itself was modest, the sort of place where everyone would know everyone else's affairs, with intimate and often unkind precision. The Duke's arrival, announced by the grandeur of his equipage and the evident breeding of his horses, would not go unnoticed. He made inquiries at the local inn, attempting to frame them with enough casualness to avoid arousing excessive curiosity. It was mentioned almost offhandedly that a lady of considerable education and genteel bearing had resided in the village these past years in the company of the widow Whitmore, now deceased. The current residence of this lady was, he was informed, the cottage overlooking the valley, a modest dwelling but one maintained with evident care. The following morning the Duke set forth on horseback, his attire deliberately simplified to a degree that would not entirely announce his rank. The spring air was crisp, carrying within it the particular scent of new growth and possibility. As he crested the ridge that provided sight of the cottage, he found his heart executing a cadence that approximated panic. The dwelling was charming in an unpretentious manner. Whitewashed walls, a thatched roof, windows that caught the morning light with an almost deliberate felicity. The garden, though not yet fully in bloom, showed evidence of careful attention. Someone had invested labor and affection in this place. He dismounted some distance away, leaving his horse tethered to a fence post. The approach to the cottage seemed to require an eternity, though it was likely only a matter of minutes. His mind, typically so meticulously organized, had become a chaos of competing impulses and contradictory impulses. What if she refused to receive him? What if the passage of years had rendered her indifferent to his presence? What if she had moved beyond the hurt and could not be reconciled to the man who had failed her so thoroughly? The door opened before he could raise his hand to knock. For a moment, neither of them moved. The woman who stood in the doorway was Lysandra, and yet she was not the woman he remembered. Time had not diminished her beauty, but it had altered its character. Where once there had been a kind of luminous youth, there was now a quality of hard-won wisdom. Her eyes contained depths that had not been present 12 years prior, the accumulated weight of solitude, reflection, and carefully managed sorrow. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice held neither surprise nor displeasure. Rather, it contained a kind of resigned acceptance, as though she had always understood that this moment would eventually arrive, and had made peace with its inevitability. "I did not expect you to read my letter as an invitation to visit. I had conceived of it merely as a final truth-telling, undertaken with no expectation of response." "Miss Vale," he replied, and he was gratified to note that his voice at least remained steady, despite the tumult occurring beneath the surface of his composure. "I have read your letter with a frequency that borders upon obsession these past 3 days, and I have traveled here not in response to any invitation, but in acknowledgement of a debt so profound that I have begun to fear I may lack the capacity to adequately repay it." She did not invite him inside. Instead, she stepped across the threshold, drawing the door softly behind her. They stood thus in the garden, the morning light illuminating the planes of her face with a clarity that seemed almost unkind in its honesty. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I wrote that letter not to demand anything of you, but to finally speak a truth that years of silence had rendered intolerable. The debt, if debt exists, belongs to me alone. I should have defended myself. I should have remained and fought against the calumny. Instead, I fled." "You fled," the Duke said, "because you possessed the magnanimity and selflessness to prioritize my reputation above your own vindication. And I—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of his remorse. "I remained silent because I was afraid." The admission hung between them like morning mist, insubstantial yet somehow obscuring everything of importance. Lysandra regarded him with an expression that contained elements of both compassion and something approaching resignation, as though she had anticipated this confession and had prepared herself for the particular pain it would occasion. "Come," she said, gesturing toward the garden path that wound between carefully tended beds of emerging flowers. "We should not stand at the doorway as though we are strangers meeting by accident on a street corner. There is a bench within sight of the valley. The hour is appropriate for conversation." They walked in silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of their clothing and the distant call of birds announcing the spring. The bench, when they reached it, was positioned precisely as she had indicated, overlooking the valley in a manner that seemed to offer a perspective on the world, both expansive and somehow intimate. The Duke found himself wondering how many hours she had spent in this location, contemplating the landscape and the interior territories of her own heart. "You were afraid," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact that required neither elaboration nor defense. "I comprehend the nature of that fear, Your Grace. The aristocracy maintains itself through careful observation of proprieties. A gentleman of your station cannot afford to appear to be influenced by anything resembling emotional attachment to a woman of inferior social position. To have defended me publicly would have been to admit to an impropriety that society could never have forgiven." "You grant me far too much excuse," the Duke replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated regret. "I did not merely remain silent, Miss Vale. I accepted the narrative that was constructed by those whom I now recognize as motivated by malice and the desire to maintain control over those around them. I allowed myself to believe that your departure was the appropriate resolution to an impossible situation. And in doing so, I committed an act of profound cowardice disguised as honor." He turned to face her fully, and she observed that his grey eyes contained depths of emotion that seemed barely contained within the boundaries of his composure. "That afternoon in the library," he continued, "was among the most meaningful hours of my entire existence. Your mind illuminated my own in ways that I had ceased to believe possible. The conversation we shared transcended the mere social pleasantries that typically comprise discourse between a duke and a member of the household staff. For those hours, we existed in a realm where such distinctions seemed not merely irrelevant, but actively antithetical to genuine human connection." Lysandra rose from the bench and walked toward the edge of the overlook, her posture upright but the tension in her shoulders betraying an inner turbulence that her composed expression did not reflect. "You must not idealize what occurred," she said quietly, "nor must you burden yourself with guilt for actions undertaken in a different time, under circumstances you could not have fully controlled. Lady Verena possessed considerable influence. The Reverend Hartwell, though well-intentioned, was susceptible to suggestion. I was vulnerable precisely because of my social position. The machinery of aristocratic propriety ground forward with an inevitability that no individual could have halted. And yet," the Duke said, rising to stand beside her, "I might have tried. I might have spoken in your defense. I might have proclaimed the innocence of our association and made clear that any scandal attached to our conduct was manufactured by those whose motivations were questionable. Instead, I chose the path of least resistance and thereby made myself complicit in an injustice." She turned to regard him, and he saw that her eyes, though dry, contained a glimmer of something that might have been tears held in abeyance through sheer force of will. "If you had done so," she said carefully, "it would have been magnificent and noble and entirely destructive to us both. Your reputation would have been damaged beyond repair. I would have become a figure of scandal and ridicule, and we would have paid the price for decades, I assure you. What I did, withdrawing quietly, allowing you to remain untainted by association with me, was not an act of selflessness, Your Grace. It was an act of love." The word hung between them, that simple yet profound utterance that transcended the careful boundaries of social convention and spoke directly to the truths that language was often inadequate to express. "You loved me," he said, and it was not a question, but a recognition of something that he had perhaps always known, but had been too cowardly to fully acknowledge. "I did," she replied, "not with the passion of youth, which is often merely infatuation, but with the deliberate, conscious choice of a woman who recognized the worth of another human being and elected to value that worth above her own desires. It was a love that could never be publicly acknowledged and therefore must be privately accepted and then released." The Duke reached toward her, not to touch, but as though his gesture alone might bridge the distance that circumstances had imposed between them. "I have spent 12 years," he said, "learning to understand the magnitude of what I lost through my failure of courage. I have had ample opportunity to contemplate the trajectory my life might have taken had I possessed the fortitude to defend you then, and I confess, Miss Vale, that in those contemplations I have discovered that I am not the man I believed myself to be. I am a man of considerable deficiencies, haunted by the knowledge of roads not taken and words not spoken." "Your Grace," she began, but he raised a hand gently. "I am not asking for anything," he said quietly. "I did not journey here with expectations or demands. I came here to offer you, belatedly and inadequately, the defense I should have provided 12 years prior. I came to acknowledge publicly, if only to you, that your honor was impugned unjustly and that you deserved far better than the manner in which you were treated by myself and by others." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The valley stretched before them, serene and indifferent to the profound emotional reckonings occurring within the hearts of two people who had once been carelessly separated by the machinery of society and circumstance. As the morning advanced toward midday, the Duke found himself seated in the modest parlor of Lysandra's cottage, partaking of tea prepared with a grace that suggested years of practice in the art of civility and domestic tranquility. The room itself was a revelation, every object speaking of a woman of considerable cultivation and refined sensibility. Books lined the shelves, their spines indicating a broad and intellectually demanding reading practice. A small writing desk occupied a corner, its surface bearing the evidence of recent correspondence. "You have made a life here," the Duke observed, accepting the offered cup with a nod of gratitude. "A genuine life, not one composed merely of duty and social obligation." "I confess that I find myself envying that accomplishment." Lysandra settled into the chair opposite him, her movements possessing that particular grace that came from years of conscious self-control. "A life is what one constructs from the materials available," she replied. "Mrs. Whitmore required companionship and care. I required employment and sanctuary. We suited each other's needs adequately. That the arrangement evolved into genuine affection was perhaps inevitable when two solitary individuals of similar intellectual temperament are forced into proximity." "And now?" the Duke asked. "What becomes of your life now that Mrs. Whitmore has departed?" "I have been left in modest financial security," she said. "I am no longer obligated to maintain employment. Technically, I am now a woman of independent means, however modest those means might be. I have been contemplating what such independence might permit me to accomplish, though I confess that the prospect of unlimited possibilities is rather more daunting than the previous necessity of obligation." The Duke set down his cup with deliberate care, recognizing that the moment had arrived when he must speak what he had journeyed 3 days to communicate. "Miss Vale," he began, and his voice carried a formality that was nevertheless suffused with genuine emotion, "I have spent considerable time during my travel contemplating what I might possibly say to repair the injuries inflicted upon you by my silence and cowardice. I have concluded that no words, however carefully constructed, can adequately address the magnitude of that injury. And yet, I must make the attempt." He rose and walked to the window, his gaze fixed upon the landscape beyond. "For 12 years, I have permitted myself to believe that your departure was ultimately for the best, that you were better removed from the sphere of my influence, that the scandal that drove you away would have only intensified had you remained. I used these rationalizations as a means of avoiding the fundamental truth, which is that I failed you when you most required defense and support." "Your Grace," she began, but he raised a hand gently, requesting permission to complete his thought. "I come not merely with apologies, Miss Vale, though apologies are undoubtedly required. I come with a question, posed with full recognition of the impropriety of posing it. These 12 years have rendered me increasingly cognizant of the fact that a life devoted entirely to duty and social obligation is, in many respects, an empty thing. I have achieved everything that my station and circumstances might permit: fortune, influence, the respect of my peers. And yet I have achieved none of the things that constitute a life of genuine meaning. He turned to face her fully, and she observed that his habitual composure had fractured sufficiently to permit genuine emotion to be visible upon his features. "Your letter offered me absolution," he continued, "not because you possessed the authority to grant it, but because you demonstrated such extraordinary magnanimity in the face of injustice. That magnanimity has illuminated for me the poverty of my own character. Across these many years, I come here not with expectations, but with a sincere request that we might begin, however tentatively, to repair what was fractured." Lysandra rose and walked toward him, her movements deliberate and measured. When she stood before him, she regarded his features with an intensity that suggested she was reading there the truth of his words written upon his countenance. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable weight of significance, "you must understand that acceptance of your apology is far simpler than you seem to believe. What requires more careful consideration is what you are proposing might follow such acceptance. A woman of my station does not occupy the same sphere as a duke. Years of separation have not altered that fundamental reality. To imagine that such a disparity might be bridged would be to indulge in a fantasy inconsistent with the realities of our society." "I am not asking you to imagine," the Duke replied. "I am asking you to consider the possibility that society, though powerful, is not immutable. I'm asking whether the woman who loved me sufficiently to withdraw in order to protect my reputation might contemplate the possibility of permitting me to spend the remainder of my life engaged in the work of deserving such love." The profound silence that followed seemed to contain within it the accumulated weight of 12 years of separation, the complex interplay of emotion and practicality, the collision between the heart's desires and the world's demands. "I cannot answer that question," Lysandra said finally, "in the moment of its asking. What I can tell you is that your presence here, your willingness to acknowledge fault and to journey in pursuit of truth, has constituted a form of reparation that I had genuinely never expected to receive. That is sufficient, Your Grace, for now that is more than sufficient." Yet even as she spoke these words, the Duke recognized something shifting in her expression, a subtle recognition that perhaps the journey that had begun 12 years prior in separation was not, in fact, concluded. The Duke remained in Ashworth for a fortnight, a duration that caused considerable speculation throughout the village, though Lysandra's careful management of social discourse ensured that no scandal of significant proportion emerged from his presence. He lodged at the inn, presenting himself as a gentleman engaged in contemplation of the countryside, a designation sufficiently vague to forestall excessive inquiry. During those 14 days, a pattern emerged that neither of them had deliberately constructed, but which seemed to possess its own internal logic. Each morning the Duke would call at the cottage, ostensibly to inquire after Lysandra's well-being and to ensure that she required nothing in terms of practical assistance. In reality, these visits provided opportunity for extended conversations that ranged across philosophy, literature, and the peculiar terrain of personal history. They spoke of books with the enthusiasm of those who regarded reading not as mere entertainment, but as essential nourishment for the soul. They walked through the surrounding countryside, and the Duke found himself observing the landscape with a precision he could not recall having previously employed. Everything seemed to contain significance: the particular way light fell through the leaves, the manner in which Lysandra moved along the path, the timbre of her voice when she spoke of the natural world. On the 8th day of his residence in the village, a letter arrived at the inn bearing the seal of his London solicitor. The Duke read it while seated in his modest chamber, and its contents occasioned a response that transcended mere professional correspondence. The letter concerned a matter that had occupied his attention for some years, a piece of property in Cornwall, substantial in scope and considerable in potential value. The land itself was productive, but there existed upon it the ruins of what had once been a significant library, destroyed during the Commonwealth period. The Duke had, for reasons he had not entirely examined, maintained possession of this property and had hired scholars to investigate the possibility of reconstruction. What the solicitor's letter now communicated was that the necessary preliminary work had been completed. The Duke now possessed in his hands the architectural drawings, the historical documentation, and the financial assessment required to undertake the restoration project. More significantly, The solicitor inquired whether His Grace intended to proceed, as such a decision would require immediate attention and considerable expenditure. The Duke read the letter a second and then a third time, recognizing in its contents a potential resolution to circumstances that had seemed irresoluble. That evening, he requested that Lysandra receive him at an hour later than their customary meeting, and when he arrived at the cottage, he bore with him the aforementioned correspondence. "I have received a letter," he said, presenting it to her with a formality that suggested its contents possessed significance. "Pertaining to a matter that I have been contemplating for several years. I should like your counsel upon it, if you would be willing to offer it." Lysandra examined the letter with evident care, her eyes moving across the lines with the precision that indicated genuine comprehension. When she had completed her reading, she regarded him with an expression of carefully controlled curiosity. "This library," she said, "it possessed historical significance beyond the merely architectural." "Considerable significance," the Duke replied. "It was one of the finest private collections in all of England during the Tudor period. The volumes were scattered following the destruction of the building, though a remarkable number have been recovered across the intervening centuries. I have been acquiring them quietly, as they have become available. I now possess perhaps half of what the collection originally contained. And you wish to reconstruct both the building and the library within it?" she asked, comprehension dawning upon her features. "I wish to do so," he confirmed, "but I have hesitated to undertake such a project without clarity of purpose. A grand library serves no meaningful function if it remains merely a monument to one man's vanity and historical interest. I have been contemplating what such a space might accomplish if properly conceived and adequately staffed." He paused, gathering his thoughts with evident care. "I have concluded that such a library might serve as a place of refuge and study for those possessed of intellectual cultivation but limited means. Scholars, particularly those of the female persuasion, who lack access to the resources that wealth and privilege typically provide. A place where knowledge might be pursued for its own sake, without regard for social station or conventional propriety." Lysandra set down the letter with deliberate care, her expression revealing the complexity of her internal reaction to this revelation. "You are describing an institution of remarkable progressivism," she said quietly, "one that flies in the face of considerable social convention. The establishment of such a library, particularly one that explicitly welcomed female scholars, would occasion significant commentary and likely criticism." "I am aware," the Duke replied, "nor do I propose to undertake such a project unless I am prepared to accept such consequences." "Why have you shared this with me?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested that she perhaps understood the answer before he articulated it. "Because," he said carefully, "I cannot envision undertaking such a project without your involvement in its conception and execution, your understanding of education, of intellectual aspiration, of the particular needs of those whom society has marginalized. These perspectives are essential to the realization of such an ambition, and I cannot conceive of proceeding without your counsel, and, if I am permitted to hope, your participation." The significance of what he was offering became gradually apparent to her. He was not merely proposing a project, he was proposing a purpose, a shared purpose that would require her intellectual engagement and her expertise. He was, in essence, offering her a means by which to transform the passive dignity of her retreat into Ashworth, into an active engagement with work that might benefit others similarly situated. "You must understand," she said slowly, "that acceptance of such a proposal would require me to leave this cottage and to return to a position of public visibility. I have spent 12 years cultivating a life of appropriate obscurity. What you are suggesting would necessarily place me within sight of those who might remember the circumstances of my departure from your household." "I am aware," the Duke acknowledged, "and I do not propose to undertake such a step without due consideration for your own preferences and comfort. Yet I must speak plainly. I believe that the world requires the wisdom and insight that you possess. I believe that your withdrawal, however understandable given your circumstances, represents a loss to those who might have benefited from your knowledge and your humanity." He moved toward the window, his silhouette framed against the fading evening light. "More selfishly, I confess that I have discovered during these past 14 days that the prospect of a life without your presence in it has become genuinely intolerable. I do not propose this library merely as a means of repairing the injuries of the past, though I hope it might constitute such repair. I propose it because it represents a future that contains genuine meaning for you for me, and for those who might eventually benefit from its existence. Lysandra remained silent for a considerable duration, her gaze fixed upon some indeterminate point beyond the window. When finally she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision arrived at through rigorous internal deliberation. "I require time to consider this proposal," she said. "Not because I am uncertain of the project's merit. It is undoubtedly meritorious. Rather, I require time to contemplate whether I possess the fortitude to undertake what would necessarily be a very public return to a sphere from which I withdrew in shame and injury." The month that followed the Duke's departure from Ashworth, for he departed whilst granting Lysandra the time she had requested, was characterized by a silence that neither of them broke through correspondence. The Duke had concluded, with a wisdom earned through years of contemplating his own failures, that the most honourable course was to permit Lysandra to arrive at her determination without interference or persuasion. During this interval of waiting, he occupied himself with the practical matters attendant upon the library project. He travelled to Cornwall to examine the ruins personally, commissioning detailed architectural studies and engaging in extensive consultation with historians concerning the probable organization and contents of the original collection. He acquired, through his agents, additional volumes from the scattered remnants of the original library. He drafted preliminary regulations governing the use of the collection and began to contemplate the practical matter of securing qualified staff. Yet despite the occupation these matters provided, he found himself increasingly aware of the inadequacy of such external labour. What the project required, what his life required, was the engagement of a mind that could perceive purpose beyond mere preservation, that understood education not as the transmission of knowledge from one vessel to another, but as the cultivation of human potential in all its manifestations. At the conclusion of that month, a letter arrived at Winthorne House. The Duke recognized the handwriting immediately, and his heart executed a cadence that approximated panic, despite his conscious awareness that such physical reactions were essentially undignified for a man of his station and years. The letter was not lengthy. In fact, it comprised only a single page written in Lysandra's precise and elegant hand. It read, "Your Grace, I have spent this past month in contemplation of the proposal you have offered, alongside the broader implications that acceptance would necessarily entail. I have examined my own heart with considerable rigor, seeking to distinguish between the desires born of emotion and those arising from genuine conviction regarding the right course of action. I have concluded that to refuse your proposal would be to commit once again the very error for which I have spent these 12 years granting you absolution, namely, the prioritization of social convention and the fear of public judgment above the pursuit of meaningful work and the service of others. Therefore I come before you with my answer. I accept the partnership you have offered in the establishment of the library. I accept the risk of public judgment and the necessity of confronting those who engineered my withdrawal from your household, and I accept the possibility that in undertaking such work, I might discover that the years of withdrawal, though painful, have equipped me with insights and perspectives that have value beyond the merely personal. I shall require 2 months to settle my affairs here in Ashworth and to prepare myself emotionally for the transition that awaits. At the conclusion of that period, I shall be prepared to travel to Cornwall and to begin the work of transforming your vision into reality. I remain, as always, yours in service and in respect." The simplicity of her acceptance, the measured tone that suggested neither enthusiasm nor reluctance, but rather a clear-eyed determination to proceed, despite difficulty, affected the Duke more profoundly than any elaborate expression of emotion might have accomplished. When the 2 months had elapsed, he travelled to Ashworth to receive her personally. The cottage, which had served as her sanctuary for so many years, was secured with a care that suggested she did not anticipate a future return. She had given notice to the village that she would be departing, and had distributed her personal effects among those who had shown her kindness during her residence. The journey from Ashworth to Cornwall required 4 days of travel, and during those 4 days, Lysandra and the Duke rediscovered a rhythm of companionship that transcended the awkwardness inherent in a situation where social convention provided no clear guidance. They spoke extensively of the library project, examining its various practical dimensions and the philosophical purposes that undergirded its existence. Yet they also spoke of literature, of history, of the landscape through which they travelled. When they arrived at the Cornish property, The ruins that awaited them were more substantial than Lysandra had perhaps anticipated. The stone structure, despite its evident decay, possessed an undeniable dignity. The Duke had arranged for temporary quarters to be prepared for her residence, situated at a respectful distance from the manor itself, yet sufficiently proximate that she might oversee the work of restoration without undue inconvenience. "Here," the Duke said, gesturing toward the ruins with evident emotion, "we shall construct something that transcends the merely personal. We shall create a sanctuary for minds and spirits that have been constrained by the arbitrary restrictions of society and circumstance. And in doing so, perhaps we shall discover that the journey that began with tears and separation might yet culminate in something approaching redemption." Lysandra regarded the ruins with an intensity that suggested she was perceiving not their present deteriorated state, but their future possibility. The shelves laden with volumes, the tables occupied by scholars in serious pursuit of knowledge, the light streaming through windows yet to be constructed. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of emotion carefully modulated into composure, "I perceive the outline of something remarkable in this endeavor. I am prepared to commit myself fully to its realization. It was not a declaration of love. Propriety and circumstances still prevented such explicit utterance. Yet in the shared vision of what they might accomplish together, in the implicit recognition that their purposes had become intertwined, there existed a bond that transcended the merely professional." As the sun descended toward the western horizon, casting the ruins into perspective and shadow, the Duke and Lysandra walked the perimeter of the property, discussing plans, offering observations, collaborating in the construction of a future that neither of them could have imagined during the dark days of their separation. 6 months of labor, intensive, demanding, and often frustrating, transformed the Cornish estate into something approaching completion. The architectural restoration proceeded with meticulous precision under the supervision of a team of skilled craftsmen. The interior design, however, represented Lysandra's particular triumph. She had worked tirelessly to envision spaces that would be simultaneously welcoming to those unaccustomed to the privilege typically associated with grand libraries and intellectually rigorous in their organization and curation. Yet the project's public unveiling represented a challenge of considerably greater magnitude than the merely physical restoration of a building. The Duke's intentions to establish an institution explicitly designed to provide intellectual resources to those whom society typically excluded from such access were sufficiently radical to occasion considerable commentary within aristocratic circles. Various members of the nobility had questioned the appropriateness of such an endeavor. Several had suggested that it represented a dangerous drift toward radicalism and a troubling erosion of the social hierarchies that maintained order and stability. The establishment of what was essentially a public library, however restricted its initial access might be, was regarded by many as a peculiar, if not actively dangerous, deviation from the proper conduct expected of a man of the Duke's station. Yet the Duke had resolved to proceed regardless, and more significantly, to associate Lysandra's name publicly with the project. This decision, though not explicitly articulated, effectively constituted a public acknowledgement of her rehabilitation and a rejection of the scandal that had driven her from his household years prior. The formal opening of the library was scheduled for a date in late autumn, and invitations were circulated to persons of significance throughout England. The event itself was to be accompanied by the presentation of the collection's catalogue, prepared with meticulous care by Lysandra, and a formal articulation of the principles governing the library's operation. In the days preceding the opening, Lysandra found herself seized by a combination of anticipation and anxiety. She would be appearing publicly for the first time in 12 years in a role that explicitly associated her with the Duke. She would be presenting herself to society as a woman of intellectual authority and professional accomplishment. The risk of encountering those who remembered, or believed they remembered, the circumstances of her previous departure was substantial and genuine. Yet beneath the anxiety lay something approaching exhilaration. She had spent 12 years in quietude, her considerable talents constrained within the modest compass of her residence in Ashworth. Now she stood upon the threshold of an opportunity to employ those talents in service of purposes that transcended the personal, to create an institution that would benefit countless others similarly situated to her own previous circumstances. The evening preceding the formal opening, the Duke requested a private audience with her in the library's reading room, a space that had been completed only days prior and which possessed an austere beauty that seemed to embody the project's fundamental principles. "Tomorrow," he said without preamble, "you will stand before representatives of society and present yourself as the intellectual architect of this institution. You will answer questions regarding your role in its conception and your vision for its future. And in doing so, you will necessarily expose yourself to judgment and commentary from those whose opinions may not be favorably disposed toward your presence or your work." "I am aware," Lysandra replied. "I have contemplated these possibilities extensively. What I wish to convey," the Duke continued, "is that you need not undertake this alone. I intend to stand beside you tomorrow not merely as the proprietor of the library, but as a man who has come to understand that the judgments rendered against you 12 years prior were unjust, and that my own failure to defend you in that moment represents a stain upon my own honor that requires remedy." He moved toward her, and though he did not attempt to touch her, his proximity suggested an intimacy born of shared purpose and genuine affection. "More than that," he said quietly, "I wish to make public declaration of my conviction that your wisdom, your character, and your intellectual contributions constitute a value to this enterprise and to society far exceeding any considerations of social station or conventional propriety. I wish the world to understand that in establishing this library, I am not merely creating an institution of learning. I am acknowledging a woman whom I have come to recognize as my equal in every particular that matters, and whose presence in my life has become essential to my own understanding of what constitutes a meaningful existence." Lysandra felt the careful composure that had sustained her across 12 years of disciplined restraint threatened to crumble. The tears that emerged were not the tears of the young woman who had departed the Duke's manor in humiliation and despair, but tears of a woman who has undergone considerable transformation through solitude and reflection and has arrived at last at a place where hope seems no longer entirely foolish. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling despite her conscious efforts at regulation, "what you are proposing transcends the merely professional acknowledgement of intellectual collaboration. You are proposing that I reclaim the place in society from which I was driven. You are proposing that my name and reputation be publicly restored." "I am proposing," the Duke replied, "that you be recognized for what you have always been, a woman of remarkable integrity, intelligence, and worth. Society may choose to resist such recognition, but I am resolved that my own conviction regarding your character shall not waver, and that I shall publicly demonstrate that conviction regardless of the judgments rendered by others." The following morning, the Duke and Lysandra stood together in the entrance hall of the newly opened library, greeting the assembled guests who had travelled from across England to observe the institution's unveiling. The presence of a woman of unmistakable accomplishment and intelligence, standing beside the Duke in a position that suggested intellectual partnership and genuine collaboration, occasioned considerable commentary and, in many instances, barely concealed surprise. Yet as the day progressed, as Lysandra's expertise became evident in her detailed explanations of the collection's organization and her articulate exposition of the principles governing the library's operation, something shifted within the assembled company. Individuals who had come prepared to render judgment found themselves instead engaged in genuine intellectual discussion. Those disposed to scrutinize found themselves instead impressed. By the time the formal opening concluded and the guests began their departure, the narrative that would subsequently circulate throughout society began to take a new shape. What had been scandal had transformed into something approaching admiration. What had been whispered judgments became open acknowledgement of intellectual accomplishment and genuine worth. As the final guests departed and the library fell into silence, the Duke and Lysandra stood together in the reading room, exhausted but triumphant. "We have accomplished something remarkable," she said quietly. "We have," the Duke agreed. "Yet, what we have accomplished extends far beyond the establishment of a library. We have, I believe, begun the work of redemption, not merely for you, though that is paramount, but for ourselves in our individual capacities, and perhaps in some small measure for a society that has been demonstrated through this day's events to be capable of recognizing truth and worth when presented with sufficient clarity." The seasons transformed the Cornish landscape with a regularity that seemed almost designed to underscore the passage of time and the permanence of change. Winter arrived with surprising gentleness, snow adorning the ruins of the library with an austere beauty that Lysandra found herself contemplating at length from the windows of her residence. The shelves, now populated with volumes meticulously catalogued and arranged, seemed to possess an almost animate quality, as though the accumulated knowledge contained within their leather bindings constituted a form of living consciousness. 6 months had elapsed since the library's formal opening, and in that interval, the institution had attracted precisely the constituency for which it had been conceived. Scholars of limited financial means, women of intellectual cultivation but restricted access to educational resources, individuals possessed of genuine curiosity regarding subjects that fell outside the conventional curriculum of universities and established institutions, all had begun to arrive at the Cornish estate seeking access to knowledge that society had deemed inappropriate for them to pursue. Lysandra had assumed the position of Director of Collections, a designation that, while not explicitly articulated, rendered her the intellectual authority governing the library's operations. She had established protocols for the admission of new members, had developed educational programs designed to facilitate intellectual growth, and had begun to correspond with scholars throughout Europe regarding the acquisition of additional volumes to augment the collection. Yet beneath the external accomplishments, the internal landscape of her emotional life had undergone equally significant transformation. The Duke, who maintained his residence at the manor adjoining the library, had established a pattern of daily consultation with her regarding matters both operational and philosophical. These consultations frequently extended well beyond what their ostensible purpose required, evolving into conversations of such intellectual depth and personal significance that both participants found themselves increasingly aware of boundaries, social, professional, and emotional, becoming increasingly attenuated. It was during one such consultation in the early weeks of winter that the Duke had broached a subject that both of them had consciously avoided throughout the preceding months. "Miss Vale," he had said, with a formality that suggested he was addressing a matter of considerable magnitude, "I find myself in possession of a question that I am uncertain whether I possess the right to articulate, yet I have concluded that continued silence upon this matter constitutes a form of dishonesty that violates the principles of candor upon which our professional association has been established." Lysandra had set down the catalogue she had been examining with deliberate care, recognizing that his tone indicated significance. "I have observed," he continued, "that the pattern of my own internal emotional life has undergone considerable transformation across these months of our collaboration. I have found myself contemplating futures previously regarded as impossible, envisioning possibilities that society's rigid conventions would ordinarily preclude, and I have arrived at the conclusion that what I am contemplating transcends the professional and the collaborative, extending into territories that conventional propriety would characterize as decidedly improper." "Your Grace," she had replied, her voice steady though her internal state was anything but calm, "I am aware of what you are suggesting. I am equally aware that to give voice to such suggestions would be to expose both of us to considerable social commentary and potential censure. I am aware," he had acknowledged, "yet I find myself increasingly convinced that a life devoted entirely to the careful management of social perception, whilst neglecting the genuine needs and authentic desires of the heart, constitutes a form of spiritual poverty that no amount of outward accomplishment can remedy. I do not propose to press the matter unduly, yet I wished you to understand that if circumstances were to alter in manner that might render such discussion appropriate, I would welcome the opportunity to articulate more fully what has become increasingly evident to me across these months of collaboration." The conversation had concluded without further elaboration, yet it had established a fundamental acknowledgement that transformed the landscape of their relationship. The boundary between professional association and personal attachment had become increasingly permeable, though neither of them had yet permitted it to dissolve entirely. It was in this state of acknowledged but unresolved attachment that the Duke had received in December a letter from his solicitor indicating that a matter of considerable legal complexity had arisen requiring his immediate attention in London. The matter concerned a property dispute that threatened to consume weeks of his time and would necessarily necessitate his departure from Cornwall. "I find this timing particularly unfortunate," the Duke had said to Lysandra when informing her of his required absence. "Yet legal matters, however inopportune their emergence, cannot be indefinitely postponed. I shall endeavour to return within the month. In my absence, I entrust the library entirely to your direction. Your judgment has proven invariably sound, and I have complete confidence in your capacity to manage its operations independently." Yet as his carriage departed for the journey to London, both the Duke and Lysandra were acutely aware that his absence represented more than merely a temporary separation. It represented a testing of the attachment that had developed between them, a separation that would permit Lysandra to contemplate, in solitude, whether the feelings she harbored were genuine affections or merely products of gratitude and proximity. The month of his absence proved far longer than the calendar would suggest. Winter deepened, snow accumulated, and the library continued its quiet work of intellectual cultivation. Yet without the Duke's presence, Lysandra found herself confronting an awareness she had been able to avoid, whilst his physical proximity could distract her from deeper truths. She was in love with him, not with the gratitude of a woman grateful for rehabilitation, but with the authentic, complex love of a woman who had come to recognize in another human being something that transcended social station, acknowledged circumstance, and aligned with the deepest requirements of her own nature. The recognition was both exhilarating and terrifying. It suggested possibilities, while simultaneously acknowledging the formidable obstacles that stood between those possibilities and their realization. Yet it also suggested that the 12 years of separation, painful though they had been, had not rendered her incapable of genuine feeling. Rather, they had equipped her with the wisdom to recognize authentic connection when it manifested. When the Duke finally returned to Cornwall in the early weeks of January, Lysandra was prepared. She understood with crystalline clarity what she had come to feel and what she believed, despite considerable social impediments, might be mutually acknowledged. The winter winds that greeted the Duke's return to Cornwall carried an intensity that seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence occupying the interior landscape of his consciousness. The legal matters that had occupied his attention in London had been resolved, yet their resolution had brought him no satisfaction. Instead, his weeks away had crystallized what months of proximity had suggested, namely, that the conventional structures governing his life had become fundamentally inadequate to the genuine needs of his heart. He had arrived at the library in the late afternoon, his journey having consumed the entirety of the preceding day and the morning of the current one. The staff had received him with the deference appropriate to his station, yet his attention was fixed entirely upon locating Lysandra. He discovered her in the reading room, seated at the large oak table that commanded the center of the space, surrounded by manuscripts and cataloguing materials. She looked up at his entrance, and in that moment of recognition, he observed something in her expression that transcended mere professional acknowledgement, something that suggested a readiness, a preparation, as though she had anticipated this meeting and had positioned herself emotionally to receive what it might contain. "Your Grace," she said, rising with composed grace, despite the evident emotion visible in her eyes, "I trust your journey has concluded safely, and that the legal matters requiring your attention have been adequately resolved." "They have," he replied, yet he found himself unable to sustain the formal distance that propriety would ordinarily require. Instead, he moved toward her with a directness that violated all conventional protocols. "Lysandra, I have spent these past weeks away from Cornwall in a state of considerable emotional torment. I have attempted to convince myself that what I have come to feel constitutes merely a temporary aberration, born of proximity and shared purpose. Yet I have failed entirely in this effort." She did not retreat, nor did she attempt to diminish the significance of what he was articulating. Instead, she remained motionless, regarding him with an intensity that suggested she had been awaiting this very articulation. "During my absence," he continued, "I have come to recognize that the life I have constructed across these many years, a life devoted to duty, to appropriate conduct, to the careful management of social perception, constitutes a profound betrayal of the authentic self that perhaps might have been cultivated under different circumstances. Yet I have also come to understand that circumstances, though they impose constraints, do not ultimately determine the essential choices that constitute a human life." He paused, gathering the words adequate to express what his heart had come to comprehend. "I am asking, Lysandra," he said, his voice carrying an intensity that seemed to elevate the moment beyond the merely personal and into territories of genuine spiritual significance, "whether you would consider the possibility of a union that would bind us together not merely in the work we share, but in the authentic companionship of two souls who have come to recognize in one another something approaching completion of themselves." The silence that followed seemed to extend across eternity, though it was likely only moments. Lysandra's eyes, those remarkable hazel-green depths that had captivated him across all the years of separation and solitude, filled with tears that were not born of sorrow, but of a joy so profound that its magnitude seemed almost overwhelming. "So, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling with emotion held in careful equilibrium, 12 years ago, I loved you with the love of youth, passionate, idealistic, and ultimately impotent to alter the circumstances that sought to separate us. I departed your household not in shame, as society believed, but in the exercise of a love that understood sacrifice as its highest expression. Yet I did not know then, and could not have comprehended, that time itself might serve not as a means of diminishing that attachment, but as a furnace within which it would be refined and deepened and transformed into something approaching genuine wisdom. She moved toward him, and for the first time in 12 years the distance that circumstance had imposed between them began, in earnest, to collapse. What I feel for you now, she continued, transcends gratitude and professional collaboration, though it encompasses both. I love you not for what you have offered me in redemption, but for who you have revealed yourself to be, a man capable of growth, of genuine remorse, of authentic commitment to purposes that transcend the personal. I would be honored, truly honored, to undertake the journey of a shared life with you, knowing that such an undertaking will necessarily expose us both to considerable social commentary and judgment. The Duke reached toward her, taking her hand with a tenderness that seemed to acknowledge both its fragility and its strength. Then let us proceed, he said quietly, with full recognition of what the world will think and the equal certainty that what we think of ourselves and of one another possesses a weight and significance that no amount of social censure can diminish. Lysandra, I wish to marry you, not as a means of social redemption, though I hope it will accomplish that. Rather, I wish to marry you as the natural culmination of a journey that began in separation and has evolved, across years of pain and reflection, into something approaching genuine union. Then yes, she replied, her voice barely audible above the sound of winter wind pressing against the windows of the reading room. Yes, Your Grace. Yes, Alistair. I will marry you. In that moment, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of countless volumes and the evidence of their shared labor, two souls that had been separated by the machinery of society and circumstance came at last to acknowledge not merely what they felt, but what they had always been capable of becoming together. 5 years have elapsed since that winter evening, when Alistair and Lysandra pronounced their vows in a small chapel adjacent to the Cornish estate, witnessed by a gathering of friends sufficiently resolute in their convictions to disregard the raised eyebrows and whispered comments of society's more rigid adherents. 5 years have transformed what was once regarded as a scandal beyond redemption into something approaching conventional acceptance, as the weight of demonstrated virtue and genuine intellectual accomplishment proved more persuasive than the most elaborate social maneuver could ever be. The library has flourished beyond the most optimistic projections that either of them had entertained in those early days of restoration and reconstruction. What began as a vision has become an institution, and that institution has begun to generate tangible ripples across the landscape of English intellectual life. Scholars of remarkable accomplishment have emerged from its halls. Women whose intellectual contributions might otherwise have been entirely suppressed by the constraints of social convention have discovered within its walls both knowledge and validation. Yet the greatest accomplishment, in Lysandra's estimation, has not been the establishment of the library itself, but rather the small volume of letters that she has compiled from the correspondence of those who have studied within its walls. These letters, addressed to potential future scholars and collectors, constitute a record of transformed lives, individuals who arrived at the library carrying the weight of social exclusion and departed carrying both knowledge and something approximating hope. It is in this context that Lysandra finds herself on an autumn evening not unlike the one that brought the Duke to her cottage in Ashworth 5 years prior, seated at the writing desk that occupies her private study within the manor. The letter she is composing is addressed not to any individual correspondent, but to those who may read this in ages hence. To whomsoever encounters this letter, in times yet unknown to me, she writes, her hand moving across the foolscap with the precision born of years of practice, I commit to written record an account of a journey that began in separation and humiliation and has evolved across the years into something approaching redemption and genuine union. I do so not because I believe my personal narrative to possess significance, beyond the merely individual, but because the principles it illustrates may possess value for those who find themselves, in their own times and circumstances, constrained by the arbitrary judgments of society and the limitations imposed by accident of birth. I was 12 years prior to my marriage to the Duke of Winthorne, a woman of considerable accomplishment, yet limited station, whose presence in his household occasioned scandal born not of genuine impropriety, but of the malice of those whose power derived from the careful maintenance of social hierarchy. I was driven from that household, and for 12 years I lived in enforced obscurity, during which time I was permitted the luxury of genuine reflection and the opportunity to transform pain into something approaching wisdom. The Duke, meanwhile, carried the weight of his own failure, his silence in the face of injustice, his acceptance of comfortable falsehoods to preserve his own reputation. For 12 years he too carried the burden of what might have been, the recognition of roads not taken and words not spoken. Yet what I wish to communicate to those who encounter this record is that the separation itself was not futile. Rather, it served a necessary function. It permitted both of us to develop in isolation and in solitude the character and wisdom that eventual reunion required. We did not meet as we were 12 years prior, when social convention and youth might have rendered our connection ultimately unsustainable. We met as we had become, transformed by pain, refined by reflection, equipped with the genuine compassion that can only be born of authentic suffering. I write this letter to those who find themselves in circumstances that society deems impossible to overcome. I write it to those whose love is deemed inappropriate by the arbitrary standards of social convention. I write it to those who have been cast into darkness and have discovered in that darkness a light born of their own internal resources. The path that Alistair and I have followed has not been smooth. Society's resistance to our union was considerable, and even now, 5 years subsequent to our marriage, there remain those who regard our happiness with a combination of skepticism and disapproval. Yet we have discovered that the judgments rendered by society possess far less weight than those rendered by our own conscience and our own understanding of authentic value. What I have come to understand across these years is that the greatest redemption does not come from society's eventual acceptance, though that is pleasant when it materializes. Rather, the greatest redemption comes from the internal knowledge that one has acted in accordance with genuine principle, that one has maintained integrity despite tremendous pressure to surrender it, and that one has loved authentically in a world that so often counsels the cultivation of cynicism and self-protection. To those who read this in future times, I offer this reflection: the barriers that society erects, barriers of class, of circumstance, of convention, are real and formidable. They cannot be wished away, nor can they be overcome through mere force of will. Yet they can be transcended through the cultivation of genuine virtue, the commitment to authentic truth-telling, and the willingness to undertake the interior labor required to become the person one claims to be. A love that is authentic does not require the validation of society. An accomplishment that is genuine does not require the approbation of those invested in maintaining the status quo. A life lived with integrity does not require the approval of the crowd. I have been loved by a duke, and that love has transformed my external circumstances beyond recognition. Yet what has been far more significant is the love I have come to extend toward myself, the recognition that I am worthy of authentic connection, that my intellectual contributions possess genuine value, and that the years of suffering were not wasted, but rather served as a crucible within which my authentic character was forged. To the scholars who will pass through the halls of this library in ages yet unknown to me, I offer this final counsel. Do not permit the world to convince you that your dreams are impossible. Do not accept the judgments of others regarding your worth or capability. Instead, commit yourself to the cultivation of authentic excellence, to the service of purposes that transcend the merely personal, and to the maintenance of integrity, even when that integrity is costly. And should you discover yourself separated from one whom you love, should circumstance force upon you a distance that seems insurmountable, do not surrender hope. Time itself may serve, if you permit it, not as a destroyer of attachment, but as a refiner of it, transforming it from something bound by passion and youth into something far more durable and genuinely beautiful. This library stands as testament to what becomes possible when two people commit themselves to purposes larger than their own personal happiness, and yet discover in that commitment happiness more profound, than they had imagined possible. May those who read this letter find within it not merely the chronicle of a personal journey, but the seeds of hope for their own transformations. Lysandra sets down her pen as the autumn darkness deepens beyond the windows of her study. Within the library proper, the shelves stand laden with volumes, quiet guardians of accumulated human knowledge and wisdom. Somewhere within the manor, Alistair moves through the corridors of a life shared with genuine partnership and authentic love. 5 years of marriage have not diminished the sense of wonder that she experiences when encountering him unexpectedly, the moment of recognition that this man who had failed her so profoundly in the past has spent those years learning not merely how to repair that failure, but how to become the person worthy of the love she had offered him across 12 years of separation. The journey that began in tears and separation has culminated not in the conventional happy ending of fairy tales, but in something far more significant, the slow, painstaking work of two people learning to build genuine union upon the foundation of authentic transformation. As she seals the letter and places it carefully within the library's archives, Lysandra permits herself a moment of genuine contentment. The world may offer numerous explanations for why her story is notable: the romantic redemption, the triumph over social convention, the vindication of her honor. Yet what she knows, in the deepest chambers of her heart, is that the true miracle lies not in the external circumstances, but in the internal conviction that authentic love, when cultivated with genuine commitment and tested through time, possesses a permanence and significance that no social judgment can diminish. The moral of the story: in the tapestry of human existence, we are often taught to fear separation, to regard distance as catastrophic, and to seek immediate reunion with those whom we love. Yet the story of Lysandra and Alistair illuminates a profound and often overlooked truth: that separation, when born of genuine love and accepted with grace, becomes not a tragedy, but a crucible. It is within the fires of enforced solitude that authentic character is forged. It is within the weight of years that shallow attachments dissolve and genuine connection deepens. The Duke's greatest failure was not his silence in the moment of crisis, though that was indeed a failure. Rather, it was his subsequent refusal to examine the magnitude of that failure, his willingness to permit himself the comfort of rationalizations and convenient falsehoods. Yet it was precisely this period of reckoning, this confrontation with his own cowardice and inadequacy, that equipped him to become truly worthy of the woman he had once failed. Similarly, Lysandra's exile from society was profoundly unjust, and yet it was within that exile that she discovered resources she could never have cultivated within the constraints of conventional life. The pain of separation became the means by which she developed the wisdom and strength necessary to meet the Duke, not as he had been, but as he had become, a man transformed by genuine remorse into something approaching genuine nobility. What this story teaches us is that redemption is not swift, nor is it comfortable. It demands of us the willingness to examine our own failures with unflinching honesty. It requires of us the capacity to extend forgiveness not merely to those who have wronged us, but to ourselves for the ways in which we have fallen short of our own highest potential. And it demands of us the profound courage to believe that authentic love, when tested across time and circumstance, emerges not diminished but refined, transformed into something far more durable than the passionate attachments of youth could ever be. The barrier between Lysandra and Alistair was not ultimately one of class, though society's rigid hierarchies certainly complicated their path. Rather, it was the barrier of their own incomplete selves, their unexamined fears, their unacknowledged failures, their refusal to confront the gap between who they claimed to be and who they actually were. It was only through the crucible of separation that they were each forced to undertake the interior labor required to close that gap, to become the people their genuine potential suggested they might be. We live in a world that counsels us to seek the path of least resistance, to accept the judgments of society regarding our worth and capability, to regard the obstacles placed before us as insurmountable. Yet Lysandra's letter to posterity reminds us that this counsel, however comforting in its initial iteration, ultimately represents a betrayal of our own authentic potential. What is required of us, instead, is the courage to undertake the genuine work, the internal labor of transformation, the commitment to authentic excellence, the willingness to love in a world that so often counsels self-protection above authentic connection. When love is genuine, time does not diminish it. Instead, time refines it, tests it, and ultimately reveals whether it was ever authentic at all. Those who have remained separated across years and found upon reunion that their attachment endures. These individuals understand something that the world often fails to teach. They understand that authentic love is not dependent upon external circumstances, social validation, or convenient proximity. Rather, it persists precisely because it is rooted in genuine recognition of another's authentic worth, tested through time and refined through the fires of separation and reunion. May we all, in our own lives and according to our own circumstances, discover the courage to undertake such transformation. May we learn to regard our pain not as merely tragic, but as potentially redemptive. And may we come to understand that the greatest love stories are not those that avoid separation, but those that transcend it. Those in which two souls, tested apart and refined through solitude, discover that their attachment, far from being destroyed by time, has been transformed into something genuinely eternal. Dear cherished subscribers and beloved community members, the story of Lysandra and Alistair speaks to something profoundly human within each of us, the capacity for transformation, the redemptive power of authentic love, and the possibility that separation, though painful, may ultimately serve purposes we cannot initially comprehend. If this narrative has moved your heart, if you have found yourself contemplating the profound themes woven throughout this tale of love, loss, and ultimate reunion, we invite you to join our growing community of Victorian romance enthusiasts. Your voice matters. Your perspective enriches the collective experience we share. We humbly ask that you subscribe to our channel to ensure you receive notification of each new story we craft. With each subscription, you signal that narratives of authentic human connection, redemptive transformation, and the triumph of genuine virtue over social convention possess value in your own life. Comment with your reflections. Tell us what aspects of Lysandra and Alistair's journey resonated most deeply with your own experience. Share how this story illuminated truths you had perhaps been reluctant to acknowledge. Engage with fellow members of our community in the discussion of what it means to love authentically in a world that so often counsels cynicism and self-protection. Your engagement transforms what might otherwise be merely entertainment into a genuine exchange of ideas and authentic human connection. Precisely the quality that both Lysandra and Alistair ultimately discovered was worth the sacrifice of all else. We look forward to continuing this journey with you, story by story, chapter by chapter, as we explore together the infinite possibilities that arise when authentic love meets the courage required to overcome all obstacles. With profound gratitude and deep appreciation, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team crafting narratives of authentic love, redemptive transformation, and the enduring power of genuine human connection, one story at a time.